Titus 1 verse 2 says, God, who cannot lie. Then it goes on to verse 12 and says, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lusts, we should have lived soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. Galatians 6:7 says this, be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. There are over 7,000 promises in the Bible. We often look at the promises which we feel are beneficial. We often don't look at the promises which we don't like to hear about. And one of them is Galatians 6:7. God is not to be mocked. What you sow, you shall reap. How do you mock God? I suppose there are a number of ways, but one is the way, at least in the Western world, is the entitlement that we seem to think we have. There's an entitlement. We think we have all the right to food, to shelter, to fuel, to income, to government assistance for everything, even if we don't do anything to actually deserve it. We have this entitlement that this is ours, whether it really is or not. Now, we all deserve to have food and fuel and shelter and a life, but there's a difference between deserving it and feeling entitled to it. Because one of the things that happens when you feel entitled is you take it for granted. And there's nothing breaks up relationships or communities more than being taken for granted. If you come to a church and you feel like you're being taken for granted all the time, your desire to stay there is not very great after a while. If you're in a marriage and you take people for granted after a while, things don't work out. You may think that you deserve to have supper at 6 o'clock every night, and maybe you do. But if you start taking it for granted and assuming it's going to be there regardless of what you think about the spouse, and you assume it's going to be there always regardless of what you do, you may go home some night and find it's not there, and neither is she. The same thing applies if you expect to have a paycheck every week and someone spends it before it actually comes in. It may stop coming in. We take things for granted. And it breaks up more marriages probably than anything else. And we as the church are supposed to be married to Christ eventually. So we should not take him for granted. It says in the Bible that he will not leave our side. He will be with us always. It doesn't say he's always going to help us every time we stumble. It says when you call out, he will hear you.
Yes.
The question is, why are you calling out in the first place?
Amen.
It's usually because you've gone astray. You see, we take God for granted. We think it's okay to come to church once or twice a year, to say you know God, and that's about it, but to assume he's always going to be there for us when everything goes awry. And he is. But the question is, does he always answer and do what we want him to do when we want him to do it? We tend to do everything in front of God. We'll do our business on Sunday. We'll avoid church for all sorts of reasons. Let's call them excuses, but their excuses are reasons. We will tend to work both in the community, do secular things ahead of spiritual things. And we still expect God to be there waiting for us whenever we cry out. Sometimes I think he does things, he allows us to get into trouble and sends certain circumstances our way just to give us a wake-up call every once in a while that, you know, we just can't ignore him and expect impunity. After all, we're not just playing with the God that we seem to think God is. He's not the white, bearded, grandfatherly type who sits on a chair and doles out presents to everybody who comes along. That has another name. It's called Santa Claus. And sometimes there's a difference, but people don't recognize it. God is a powerful, powerful being. One person says with one hand, he makes the rings of Saturn 100,000 miles in diameter. With his other hand, he's making the tiny claw on the foot of a microscopic insect.
Wow.
He's made the universe, 2 trillion galaxies, more than we can ever count. The sun that we have is one small star out of hundreds of billions. And yet, in 1 second, the sun releases enough energy equivalent to 1 trillion 1 megaton bombs. Think about it. 1 trillion 1 megaton bombs. There's enough energy released in that 1 second to power all of humanity for 500,000 years. Yet God allows it to be just enough to allow us to live on this planet. This is the God we take for granted. This is the God we tend to deny, except when we have troubles. And then we run to him as if he's going to be there always for us. And in most cases, he still is. But don't be deceived. He's not to be mocked. And what we sow, we will eventually reap. There's a story in Luke about a wealthy man who had so much stuff, he wanted to build new barns to hold his goods. He said, I will build new buildings for all the new increase in my wealth I'm going to have. And God said, foolish man, tonight your soul will be required of you. Tonight your soul will be required of you. So don't keep up building up treasures for yourself and not be rich toward God. Don't mock God. What you sow, you will reap. That's one of the multiple promises from a God who cannot lie.
Amen.
Something to think about.